Hi, I'm Tara, and you're listening to You Should Write a Book, the podcast. My brief bio goes like this. I met my husband at a nudist park. Turns out he was a rock star. Our son was an honored guest at our wedding. And then I trained to become a priest. And people responded by saying, you should write a book. In the last episode, you heard about how we met, the run to the border, and the death of his mother. So what happened next? Let's find out, shall we? The death of Chris's mom, Sonia, was, of course, devastating. She and Doug, my father-in-law, had been part of the theatrical community in and around Toronto and were beloved by many. Her funeral, therefore, was an event. While Chris continued working at his new teaching job in Oakville, and Doug made plans for the funeral, it fell to me to, clean the house. Not that it was in terrible shape, but because Sonia had been sick for so long, it just needed some TLC. It must have been February of 1998 by this time. My pregnancy was progressing as expected. But unlike some new moms, I did not glow. I didn't have a lovely little basketball belly. No, I spread out more like a snowman that's beginning to melt. On the day of the funeral, I was accompanied by my mom and my sister Dale. My only memory of that event was meeting Anne, Chris's wife, for the second time. As she and her mom came over and met me and my mom and sister, I said that Drake and I had some news to share. Drake looked at her and said, I'm going to be a big brother. Yes, I was a coward. Chris was more of a coward. But I had waited until there were witnesses to share the news. She was, of course, gracious in the moment. I asked Anne if it was okay if Drake called my sister Auntie Dale and my mom Grandma Shirley. She agreed, but in retrospect, what else was she going to do? She must have felt accosted by all of this new information. To not keep you in suspense, turns out that she and I have a very nice friendship all of these years later, for which I am eternally grateful. Come to think of it, it's lasted longer than my relationship with Chris, but I'll leave that story for another day. As family and close friends gathered back at the house in Mississauga, my body was telling me it had had enough. I started feeling tightening around my belly every few minutes, and I was sure I was going into labor, very premature labor. I called my midwife, and she said it was probably Braxton Hicks, a kind of false labor, and I should sit with my feet up and have a glass of wine to open up the blood vessels. I did as she instructed, and predictably, Chris's family was now sure I was an alcoholic. I have a vague memory of starting a fight with an elderly relation who demanded that I name the baby John Wesley if it was a boy. There was already enough Johns in the family, and who the hell was she to tell me anything? I think someone came and pulled me out of the room. Chris was a mess. I was tired and cranky, and afraid I was going to give birth right there on the floor. February was not a great month. A few weeks after the funeral, I called my midwife to tell her that I was pretty sure that my water just broke. It was early, 7 weeks early, as far as we could tell. Remember when I said that the birth control shot that I'd been taking had the side effect of not having a period? That meant that I hadn't had a period for over 2 years at that point. So I was either giving birth to a baby elephant or, according to the math, it was too early to have this baby. She came to my house to check. I can't tell you how much I loved having a midwife. But because I didn't gush water, she had to use a strip to determine whether or not it was amniotic fluid. It was. I had a slow leak, and this baby wasn't going to wait until his due date in April to show up. I won't bore you with every detail of the next week or so, but I will hit the highlights, mostly because they're funny. I was admitted to the hospital because I was at high risk of infection. They pumped me full of steroids to make sure the baby's lungs were fully developed before the birth. No one told me that the side effect of steroids is red blotches all over your body. I was sure I had the measles. About 5 days later, on March 3rd, they decided that the baby was safer out than in, so they induced labor at 9 p.m. on an empty stomach, on very little sleep. I don't recommend it. All night I labored, contractions coming every 90 seconds, me refusing an epidural like an idiot, my body not opening any more than 4 centimeters, obstetricians and brand new residents popping their heads in every few hours to say, "We need to do a C-section," and my midwife telling them no. All the while, Chris was in the corner of the room marking homework and agreeing with the doctors, and me screaming, "It's not you they want to cut open." It was all very dramatic. By 4:30 a.m., I was begging for an epidural. And when the incompetent nurse on duty let me almost fall off the table because I hadn't signed a consent, I wrote "fuck you" on the form just as the anesthesiologist stuck the needle into my spine. Sweet, sweet relief. The day nurse came on duty at 7 a.m. and changed everything. In contrast to the chaos of the overnight shift, she turned down the lights, propped pillows around me, and spoke in soothing tones so I could get some rest. Tamara, my midwife, was sitting in a chair with her head resting on the bottom of my bed, napping when she could. For some reason, at about 4:30 p.m., Chris decided that he needed to go to the bank. Not long after he left, the fun began. My sister Dale, who couldn't have kids of her own, stood beside my head and held my hand as my mom pressed herself up against the wall at the bottom of my bed, afraid that someone would ask her to leave. Although the OBGYN had to be present because it was a premature birth, they allowed my midwife to do all of the work. With one final push, out he came, perfect and healthy and screaming. I guess the steroids had worked. My sister asked, "Is it a boy or a girl?" And I said, "It's a baby." It was a boy. And, contrary to family tradition, we called him Wesley John. After just 10 minutes of snuggling into my chest, they took him to the PICU to be checked out, as all preemies do. By the time Chris got back from the bank, I was showered and dressed, and Dale said, "Congratulations, it's a boy." He thought she was kidding. I had to stay in the hospital for 5 days with my brand new little boy. He was little, and I was new at this. It took about that long for my boobs to figure out how to feed him. It was around day 4, I think, when I met my brother Wade across the street from the hospital for a beer. Yeast. By the time I made it back to the PICU, I was so engorged I couldn't put my arms down. I didn't care if he was hungry. He was going to nurse, god damn it. The staff would call me in my room in the middle of the night and say, "Mrs. Livingston, your baby's crying." And coming out of a deep sleep, I would think, "But Mrs. Livingston is dead." When we finally got to take him home, I was terrified. This little human who needed me for everything. Again, I give thanks for the midwife, Tamara, who came to my house for the next 6 weeks to check on us both. While I'd been in the hospital, Chris had made the decision to block up a hole that was underneath the house. We lived just a few houses up from the railroad tracks in the industrial part of town, and a cat had been living and mousing underneath our old house for years. Because Chris didn't like the smell that he attributed to the cat, he blocked the hole, and we were overrun with mice. I should also mention that Chris was afraid of mice. So there was upside down plastic containers all over the floor covering the dead and dying mice who had found the poison. Me and my little 6-pound infant and dead mice. It was delightful. Chris never proposed. We just started planning the wedding. My dad wasn't well, hadn't been for years, and he was getting sicker by the day. It was important that he walk me down the aisle. So on July 25th of 1998, we made it all legal. I had pumped enough milk to satisfy Wesley for the day, but he really wasn't fond of the bottle. During the service, he started wailing and my arms automatically went up to cover my boobs, which were beginning to leak. All of my cousins were laughing. After the service, I went to the washroom, took off my dress and hung it over the bathroom door, and sat with Wesley, feeding and providing me with sweet, sweet relief. Chris's 92-year-old grandmother came in, saw the dress, saw the nursing infant, and guffawed. I was never going to be good enough for this family. We were continuing to go to the nudist park during all of this. In the summer, we had befriended a couple who also had a nursing baby. Found out in a very interesting way that babies don't discriminate between boobs with milk in them. During this time, I watched my pregnant body snap back into pre-baby form in no time at all. So easy. Oh, how naive I was. In September of that year, Chris lost his job in Oakville. I think he was doing substitute work for the Hamilton School Board after that, maybe covering a maternity leave. Wesley had weaned himself off the breast by around November. Just after Christmas, I was out having coffee with my friend Arlene, and during the conversation, it occurred to me I was pregnant again. I wanted 2 kids close together, but wow, I didn't even have to try. Wesley's first birthday rolled around, and we had a party at my parents' place. My dad wasn't looking so good. Right after dinner and cake, Mom, uncharacteristically, discreetly asked us all to leave. Not long after we got home, Mom called to say that Dad was in the hospital. You see, he'd been having a heart attack while we were there, but he didn't want to upset anyone. By the next morning, Dad had suffered through a grand mal seizure. His kidneys were failing. His liver was iffy, and he'd had a stroke. This one took out his right side, and he lost his ability to speak, so all he had left was the use of his left leg. He'd lost the use of his left arm years before. For the next few days, I had to rely on friends to look after Wesley to be at the hospital, at the bedside of my dad. My oldest brother, who hadn't had anything to do with my parents for about 10 years, showed up with his wife and after speaking to the doctor came out and declared, "He's gonna live." We, my mom, my sister, and me, knew that my dad didn't want to live anymore. We knew that he had been saying goodbye to us in his own way for over a year. And if he did live, what kind of life would it be? Not able to speak, not able to walk or feed himself. He had been sick and ailing for years, a very long time, and he was tired. Well, my mom had absolute authority over his medical decisions, both by way of being his wife and in writing. The doctors were hesitant to proceed with withdrawing life support without my brother being on board. See, he was responding out of guilt. He needed my dad to live so that he could somehow try to make up for all of the times that he'd been shitty. The rest of us had made our peace. My other two brothers, Wade and Drew, were both far away with work, but they knew what was happening, and while they were sad, they knew that allowing my dad to pass peacefully was the right decision. It was the 11th of March when we turned off the machines. Around his bed stood me, my mom, my sister, my eldest brother and his wife, and my brother Wade's ex-wife, and the parish priest. We wept. We reassured my dad that Mom would be okay, and that Drew and Wade wished that they could be there to say goodbye, and that it was time for him to rest. And so he did. He breathed his last and was at peace. It was the first time I'd ever been in the room with a person who died. And little did I know that it wouldn't be my last. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for listening. Bye.